The first rule I learned as a rookie investigator was that a city never forgets. It only changes the wallpaper. New street lamps arrive, old alleys get renamed, and the past becomes easier to step over without looking down. I serve in Greywater District now, with a badge that catches light when reporters come around and feels dull when I am alone. The badge does not make me brave. It simply makes my fear useful. When the radio in our patrol car clicks and hisses at midnight, I sometimes hear another sound underneath it, a smaller sound, like a child counting footsteps. I count too, because once, the person I loved most vanished on a road so short it should have been safe. I was 10 on 12 July 2010. The air was wet and heavy, the kind of heat that sticks to skin and makes every breath feel borrowed. Our house stood behind the coastal market, narrow as a corridor and always smelling faintly of cooking oil and river mud. My mother Dow ran a kiosk by the main road where she sold ice pops, cigarettes, and bottled water to factory workers. My father, who he worked shifts at Bluegate Solvents, a place that hummed through the night and posted warnings on every gate like the warnings could protect anyone. They were busy in the way adults call responsible, and their responsibility turned the kitchen into my assignment. I cooked lunches, packed them into tins, and carried them to the kiosk when I was supposed to, because being useful kept arguments away. That morning the kitchen felt smaller than usual. The fan pushed hot air in circles. Rice steamed in a dented pot, and my head swam as if the room had tilted. I told myself it was sun and fatigue, because children prefer harmless explanations when the dangerous ones are too big to hold. My little sister Mai, 8 years old and too thin for her own shirt, sat on the floor eating cold noodles. She had been sick since the previous winter, a wheeze that arrived without warning and made doctors speak softly. She watched me sway and said, in a voice trying to sound grown, that she could carry the food today. It was only 10 minutes, she insisted. One straight road, no shortcuts, no alleys, nothing hidden. She smiled at me with a brightness that looked borrowed, like she had copied it from another child. I should have argued longer. But my eyelids suddenly felt heavy, as if someone had tied tiny weights to them. Mai pressed a cup into my hands, lukewarm water that tasted faintly sweet and carried a chalky grit at the bottom. I drank because she gave it, and because love makes you careless with your own safety. She tucked the lunch tins into a woven basket, adjusted the strap across her shoulder, and stood at the doorway for a heartbeat. Her mouth curved into a grin, yet her eyes looked wet, as if she might cry, and was choosing not to. She told me not to steal her noodles, a joke we had used 100 times, and I tried to answer with the same teasing voice. My words came out slow. The room drifted away like a boat leaving shore. I woke to pain and shouting. My father's palm had landed on my cheek, and the sting snapped my mind into a bright, cruel focus. He demanded to know why I had not delivered the lunch. I tried to say that Mai had gone instead, but the sentence tangled in my throat. Then I saw the bowls on the table, noodles half-eaten, and I understood with a cold jolt that my sister was still not back. My skin went tight. The sweat on my neck turned icy. I ran out barefoot, ignoring the gravel biting my heels, and chased the road as if speed could reverse the last 2 hours. We searched like people who believed the ground would yield to desperation. We ran to the kiosk, to the market stalls, to the riverbank where children sometimes slipped and adults sometimes pretended not to look. We checked old wells behind warehouses and peered into drainage ditches that smelled of rust. The road between our house and my mother's kiosk was short and straight, bordered by 2 grills that stayed closed until evening, and a small shop that sold tea eggs but shut its door during the hottest hours. There were no cameras then, no convenience store footage, no social media posts to timestamp a sighting. Neighbors shook their heads. Nobody had seen her. The day swallowed her without leaving crumbs. By evening, the police called it a disappearance, the kind of phrase that sounds calm and administrative while it rips families apart. My mother heard the words and turned them into a weapon. She grabbed my shoulders and shook me, calling me lazy, selfish, unfit to be a sister, and every label stuck to my skin like dried sweat. My father paced the yard and cursed at the air, then kicked the dust near my feet as if he wanted to kick me but needed witnesses to keep his hands clean. My grandmother Thu, who lived next door and considered devotion a substitute for kindness, murmured prayers that sounded like verdicts. She said heaven punished the careless. Nobody asked what I remembered about the water, because nobody believed memory mattered when blame was easier. After that day, our home became a museum of silence. My mother stopped speaking to me as if words themselves would betray her grief. My father spoke only to accuse, and his accusations were so routine they became the soundtrack of my adolescence. My grandmother spoke of forgiveness, as a prize I would never earn. I learned to pack quickly, to leave early, to stay late at school, and to sleep at relatives' homes whenever possible. Yet every weekend I walked the same road, staring at weeds, cracked tiles, and fences, imagining secret paths where none existed. I stood at the intersection where the kiosk sign used to hang and waited for a small figure with a basket. Waiting is what children do when they have no power. I waited until my feet grew into my shoes and waiting turned into obsession. I left for a training school the moment I could. People like to say ambition saved me, but it was guilt that kept my spine straight. I studied criminal procedure the way hungry people study menus, with urgency and anger. I watched lectures about missing persons and wrote notes until my fingers cramped. At night, I replayed that summer day and tried to find a moment where I could have changed everything, because believing you had control feels less terrifying than accepting you did not. When I graduated and applied to the bureau, I told the interview panel I wanted to protect the community. That was true. I also wanted permission to dig into my own past, without being called hysterical. On 09, May 2025, I became a probationary officer. The city handed me a desk, a password, and stacks of paperwork that smelled of toner and exhaustion. I pinned an old photo of Mai inside the top drawer rather than on the wall, because I had learned what people do with grief they cannot understand. In my first month, I handled petty theft reports, domestic disputes, and traffic statements. Then one afternoon, a file landed in front of my supervisor, Captain Min Kwang. He saw my name, my trembling hands, and the photograph I tried to hide when I opened the drawer. He did not pity me. He asked me to tell him what happened, slowly, as if we were building a case rather than a confession. I described the heat, the straight road, my long nap, and the slap that woke me. I admitted the shame that had followed me like a shadow. Captain Min Kwang listened without interrupting, then asked a question that rearranged my memory. He asked whether my symptoms truly matched heat illness. He listed the common signs and compared them to what I described, and his voice stayed neutral, as if neutrality were a tool. Then he said that my deep, long sleep sounded more like sedation than exhaustion. The suggestion felt like stepping onto a bridge that had always existed, but had been hidden by fog. If I had been drugged, then my failure was not laziness, it was a trap. But who traps a child? And why? We reopened the old case file. The paper was brittle and smelled of years spent ignored. The original investigators had recorded the search zones, the lack of cameras, and the interviews with neighbors. The last page ended with a stamp that read "Unsolved" and a date that looked like a closed door. Captain Min Kwang told me, "Unsolved does not mean impossible. It means unfinished." We rebuilt the timeline on a whiteboard and marked every assumption with a red question mark. We wrote down what the adults said that day, because adult stories often contain the shape of their guilt. We also wrote down what a child's body can reveal, because bodies do not lie to protect reputations. While we worked on my old case, new cases kept arriving, because tragedy does not respect personal schedules. One evening, a couple rushed into the station claiming their 8-year-old had vanished near the seaside park. The mother's hands shook so hard her phone nearly fell, and the father spoke in a low voice that tried to sound devastated. I asked for landmarks and times. He answered too quickly, and once, when he thought nobody watched him, relief slipped across his eyes like a shadow. I had seen that look before. Some parents arrive hoping the police will fix an accident. Other parents arrive hoping the police will carry their burden away. We searched the shoreline through rising tide and found the child the next day. The case did not belong in my reopened file, yet it sharpened my focus. If people could abandon a child in 2025, they could have done worse in 2010. 2 weeks later, I returned to the road of my childhood. It no longer looked like the road in my memory. The district had renovated the area into a night food street, plastering neon over old concrete, as if brightness could erase stains. Even at midnight, vendors shouted and music thumped, and the smell of grilled meat hung in the air. I walked slowly, letting my feet remember what my mind had edited. At the corner where the tea egg stall used to be, a new cart steamed with spices. The vendor was an older man with milky eyes. He faced the street as if he could see it, and when I stepped near, his head turned toward my footsteps with a precision that made my throat tighten. He called my childhood nickname without hesitation, and I felt the hair on my arms rise. I asked how he recognized me. He laughed and said uniforms have a sound, which was both absurd and true. He tried to hand me eggs without payment, insisting my job brought honor to the old neighborhood. His generosity felt unnatural, like an apology offered before the offense was named. I paid anyway and lowered my voice. I told him I was reviewing an old disappearance, and that helpful information could earn a reward. The man's ladle paused midair. He exhaled and said he could not promise precision, but his ears remembered more than his eyes ever could. He told me that on the afternoon Mai vanished, he had been in his back room, not selling, because the heat made business slow. He kept his door closed, yet he listened to the street, the way blind people often do. He heard a small set of footsteps pass first, light and quick, carrying something that swung. Then, later, he heard heavier steps, adult steps, approaching from the direction of my house. Those steps stopped near my yard, lingered, then moved toward my grandmother's gate. A minute after that, the district radio tower chimed the half-hour, a sound that always drifted down the road. The vendor said he remembered because he used the chime to time his boiling pot. He said my father later claimed he discovered the disappearance after the hour, and the chime told him that was a lie. That single detail cracked the old narrative. I brought it to Captain Min Kwang, and he did not celebrate. He drew a new timeline, anchored to the radio chime and the vendor's sensory memory, and asked what else we had treated as fact because it was repeated loudly. We listed potential access points to the house that day, and circled the water jug in my kitchen, because children do not sleep through panic without a reason. We pulled my father's employment records at Blue Gate Solvents, and confirmed he left his shift early that day. We found that my mother's kiosk had closed unexpectedly at noon. Those facts were small, but small facts build big indictments. Reopening an old case in a tight community is like stirring mud in a clear pond. Everything that's settled tries to rise. I revisited 2 alibi witnesses who had protected my family years ago. One was a woman who had testified for a local thug my parents blamed, and she greeted me with contempt, shouting that her testimony had ruined her chance to marry well, as if truth were a commodity she had wasted. She did not retract her statement, but she revealed grudges that explained how easily people lie when they think they deserve compensation. The second witness was a neighbor who attended prayer meetings with my grandmother. She refused to look at my badge. Her fingers worried a necklace, and her lips moved silently, counting prayers like coins. When I offered her immunity for perjury if she corrected her statement now, her shoulders sagged as if a heavy coat slipped off. She whispered that she had not been at my grandmother's house at the time she claimed, but she had been afraid to say so because Thu knew secrets about everyone. I went to confront my grandmother on a cool morning when she was drying salted radish strips in the courtyard. The smell of salt and sun hit me and dragged me back into an older memory I had tried to bury. When I was 6, my parents left Mai and me with Thu, while they took me to a clinic for pneumonia. A religious gathering filled the house, and my grandmother treated hospitality like a performance. My sister, hungry and ignored, wandered into the courtyard and ate the salted radish meant for winter. She drank no water all day. That night she coughed until her ribs ached, and afterwards she wheezed for years, the doctors warning that certain triggers could kill her. I told my grandmother that she had started the sickness, and now I needed to know whether she ended my sister's life. My grandmother's eyes sharpened. She said she had confessed to her God. She said a confession should be enough. She asked why I dug up what was already buried. My parents arrived during the argument, drawn by raised voices like people drawn to fire. My father stepped between me and my grandmother as if protecting her proved righteousness. My mother stood behind him with folded arms, her face a wall I had stared at for 15 years. For the first time since Mai vanished, she spoke directly to me. Her voice was soft, which made it more frightening, because softness can hide knives. She said the past was the past, and begged me to stop investigating because my younger brother Kai planned to apply for a government post. She said my questions would stain his future. My father lifted his hand as if to strike me, then lowered it when he noticed the officers' cars down the road. In that moment, I understood that I had never been family to them. I had been a problem managed by silence. That night, I called Captain Min Kwang and told him I was ready to pay whatever the truth demanded. He warned me that truth has collateral damage, and I said lies had already collected their interest from my life. We assembled a small team and arrived before dawn on 06 October 2025. The neighborhood was quiet, but inside my grandmother's house, chaos erupted quickly. My grandmother tried to faint. My father tried to bully the officers with volume. My mother cried and begged as if tears could rewrite law. None of it worked. The cuffs clicked, metal finality around wrists that had held my childhood down. My brother stood in the doorway, his face pale, his jaw tight, and he did not speak. He looked at me the way strangers look at storms, with anger, fear, and helplessness. Detaining them was not the same as proving what happened. Without physical evidence, their lawyers could turn the story into a misunderstanding, and misunderstandings are wealthy people's favorite costume. I searched the property for anything that did not fit, anything the earth might confess. In the back corner, a young tree stood greener than its neighbors, leaves thick and glossy as if fed by a hidden source. I remembered my field instructor explaining that decomposing bodies release nitrogen and other elements that change soil chemistry, and that plants above burial sites can grow unnaturally vibrant. It felt grotesque to reduce my sister to a lesson, but science is one of the few places where emotion does not distort truth. I marked the spot and requested a warrant for excavation. On 07 October 2025, the forensics team arrived with tarps, measuring rods, and tools small enough to respect evidence. Digging is slow when you care about what you might find. The first meter was only dirt and stubborn roots. The second meter revealed fabric fragments that looked like old ribbon. When the first bone piece appeared, pale and quiet against the brown soil, my breath stopped as if my body refused to process the obvious. The medical examiner spoke in a gentle voice meant for living relatives. The team documented every layer, every object, every shift in soil color. My hands shook, and I kept them behind my back, because this was not the moment for contamination. When the remains were lifted onto a clean sheet, I finally knelt, and grief that had been frozen for 15 years thawed at once, hot and humiliating. The laboratory confirmed identity through what the body still offered: measurements, fragments of clothing, trace minerals. The confirmation was both relief and ruin. For years I had imagined Mai alive somewhere, adopted, trapped, renamed, waiting to be found. Now I had an answer that fit inside a bag. Uncertainty is a special form of torture, yet certainty can be a blade. In the interrogation rooms, my family's stories began to crack. My father admitted he had stolen chemicals from Bluegate solvents, tiny amounts hidden in toolboxes, because the plant's inventory was strict and he feared being caught. He claimed the substance was meant to end a child's life quietly, like a decision made efficiently. My mother admitted she had closed her kiosk at noon and returned home for a conversation she would not describe. My grandmother insisted she had only offered sugar water as a kindness, then stopped speaking altogether, as if silence were her last prayer. The motive surfaced in pieces, as motives often do when people are ashamed to say them aloud. At the time, there was a local policy loophole. If a family's only child had a severe disability, the family could apply for permission to have another child. My parents wanted a son, and they wanted him without losing my father's city status and job privileges. In their calculation, my existence was inconvenient. My sister's illness was not a tragedy to them, it was paperwork. According to what they finally admitted, they believed if I died, they would have a grieving story and a legal reason to try again. The plan required sedating me and making my death look like an accident later, a story that could be sold. They told my grandmother to act on the child who delivered lunch the next day, because plans are fragile and criminals are rarely as organized as they imagine. That detail mattered, because on 12 July 2010, the child who carried lunch was Mai, not me. Their failure to coordinate killed the wrong child, and their rage at that mistake became the reason they hated me. Even with confessions, 2 questions refused to settle. First, the chemical my father described should have taken longer to kill than what witnesses suggested. Second, none of the 3 admitted to sedating me, yet my long sleep that day had swallowed urgency, as if urgency were nothing. Captain Min Kwang entertained the possibility that I had been exhausted and overheated, but my body remembered something different, and bodies remember even when minds deny. I asked for a certified hypnotherapist on 10 October 2025, not because hypnosis is magic, but because trauma hides details behind ordinary words. In the session room, the lights were soft, and the chair was comfortable in a way that felt like a trap. The therapist guided me back to the kitchen, minute by minute, breath by breath, until memory sharpened like a blade. In the recovered scene, Mai hovered close to me, bringing me water more than once, her fingers trembling at the rim of the cup. The water tasted faintly sweet, and there was a powdery residue that clung to the bottom. She kept watching my face as if waiting for a sign that I would collapse. The therapist asked about her expression, and I saw it clearly. She was trying not to cry, and the effort made her eyes shine. The therapist asked what she did before leaving. I saw her reach under the porch and slide something into her pocket, something dried and pale, the salted radish, the same food she had been told never to eat again because it could choke her lungs. In the memory, she hugged me hard, too hard for an ordinary goodbye, then picked up the basket and walked out with the calm of someone who had already decided the ending. When the hypnosis session ended, my throat felt raw, as if I had swallowed sand. Captain Min Kwang sat across from me, eyes rimmed red, and he said no child should have to plan her own death. The new detail explained everything that had looked impossible. The poison my grandmother offered in sugar water might not have killed quickly on its own, but the salted radish could have triggered my sister's airway to constrict, speeding the end. The powder in my water might not have been industrial poison, but a sedative from a medicine cabinet, enough to drop a 10-year-old into deep sleep. I finally understood the shape of my sister's courage. She had overheard adult conversations, recognized that I was the intended target, and engineered a substitution. She did not choose death because she loved pain. She chose it because she loved me, and because children raised around cruelty learn to solve problems with whatever tools they can reach. My grief changed texture. It was no longer only guilt. It was also awe, and awe is a terrible gift. After charges were filed, my parents requested to see me. The visiting room smelled of disinfectant and stale anger. My father stared at me as if I had betrayed him, not as if he had betrayed 2 daughters. He said I had destroyed the family for the sake of a sick child who was already doomed, and the cruelty in his certainty made my hands shake. My mother's eyes were flat, and she said if the right child had died, everything would have been easier. I told them ease is not the same as justice, and I told them their son's future did not deserve to be built on a grave hidden under a tree. My grandmother whispered prayers under her breath and would not look up, as if heaven were a ceiling she could climb a way through. I left without shouting. I had shouted enough in my life to know it rarely teaches the guilty anything. My brother Kai avoided me for weeks. When he finally agreed to meet, he chose a cafe far from the neighborhood, as if distance could disinfect reality. He asked why I could not have stayed quiet, why I had to dig into a story that embarrassed him. I told him embarrassment is a luxury compared to an unmarked burial, and I told him that a future built on lies rots from the inside. I reminded him that he did not ask to be born into this, and I did not blame him for my parents' choices, but I refused to let him use those choices as a reason to demand my silence. He did not apologize. He simply stared at his coffee until it went cold, and when he left, his shoulders looked older than his age. The trial moved slowly, because courts prefer patience to passion. In hearings, my grandmother clutched a prayer book and muttered that she had confessed, as if confession were a coin she could pay with. The judge reminded her that confession is not immunity, and the courtroom held a quiet that felt like learning. I watched my mother's posture, chin lifted, lips tight, eyes never soft. I watched my father's refusal to meet my gaze, as if eye contact might admit he had tried to erase his own child. When the sentences were read on 09 October 2025, the judge's voice remained steady, refusing drama. I did not stand to make a speech. Justice does not need my eloquence. It needs records, evidence, and the stubbornness to keep going when the truth hurts. After the verdict, I returned to my desk and picked up a new file, because work does not pause for personal closure. Yet I noticed something in myself that had changed. I listened more carefully to small inconsistencies in statements, because my own case had taught me how lies hide in casual timing. I watched parents' faces when their children went missing, because I had learned that grief and relief can look similar if you have not been trained to see. I documented details with more patience than my younger self would have believed possible. In that sense, Mai continued to shape my hands even in absence, turning my pain into attention, and attention is the first ingredient of protection. I buried Mai on a hillside outside the city where the wind comes in from the sea, and the grass bends as if bowing. I planted white daisies near her marker, because once, long ago, she pointed at daisies and called them brave for blooming in poor soil. Every week I visited with a bowl of noodles, plain and hot, the kind she used to eat on the kitchen floor. I spoke to her as if she could answer, and perhaps she did, in the way the living keep the dead inside the heart. I told her about cases solved and cases lost, about nights when the station felt too loud, and about mornings when sunlight on the river made me believe in gentleness again. I apologized less over time, not because I cared less, but because I began to understand that her last act was not an accusation toward me. It was a blessing she forced into being. People sometimes ask whether closure arrived once the bones were found and the confessions signed. I tell them closure is not a door that clicks shut. It is a window that finally opens, letting air into a room that has been sealed for years. The air is cold at first. It stings. Then, slowly, you learn to breathe again. Some nights I still dream of the straight road, but the dream has changed. In the old version, I stood at the intersection waiting for Mai to appear, basket swinging, smile bright, and I woke soaked in regret. In the new version, I run after her, faster than guilt, and I reach her shoulder before she steps out of sight. I tell her she does not have to be brave for both of us. The dream ends there, not with a miracle, but with a touch. When I wake, I count my breath, put on my uniform, and go back into the city that never forgets, because neither do I. In the weeks between the raid and the hypnosis session, Captain Min Kwang made me work other cases on purpose. He said fixation can blind you, even when you think you are seeing clearly. I took statements from shopkeepers about a series of scooter thefts, and learned how quickly rumors rewrite facts. I sat with a child who had run away from home and watched her posture soften only after I promised not to shout. Each case reminded me that missing does not always mean dead, and dead does not always mean missing, and that the difference lies in evidence, not hope. I also visited Blue Gate Solvents under the pretext of reviewing old safety procedures. The security office had upgraded their systems since 2010, but old logbooks still sat in cabinets. I found a record of a minor chemical discrepancy reported the week after Mai vanished, noted as a paperwork mistake and closed without investigation. The entry was small and would have meant nothing to most people. To me, it looked like a fingerprint left on a window pane, visible only when the light hit at the right angle. I copied the page and handed it to our prosecutor, who said quiet evidence often survives louder stories. The blind egg vendor came to the station once after hearing about the arrests. He stood in the lobby holding a bag that smelled of star anise and pepper, refusing to sit, as if sitting would make him part of the mess. He told me he had replayed that afternoon in his head for years, wondering whether his silence had helped my family bury the truth. I told him he was not responsible for criminals' choices. I also told him that his memory, anchored to the radio chime, had provided the thread we needed. He bowed awkwardly, then said he would keep his card open at midday from now on, so no child would ever pass a closed door thinking nobody could see or hear them. During one interview, my mother tried to steer the narrative back to my supposed laziness, insisting I had always been selfish, and that I must have pushed Mai into danger. I placed the lab report on the table and asked her to explain the sedative residue found in a cup from our old kitchen set, a cup she had kept in storage like a trophy. Her breath caught, and for the first time her composure cracked. She did not confess out of regret. She confessed because evidence is harder to argue with than a child. Watching her choose confession without compassion taught me that some adults never outgrow the instinct to protect themselves first. At night, I read my childhood diaries, thin notebooks filled with cramped handwriting. I had written about school, about chores, and about Mai's jokes, but I had also written a line I had forgotten. Mai hugged me too long today. I stared at the line until it blurred. Children record truth without understanding it. The line was not proof in court, but it was proof in my heart. It told me that the goodbye on 12 July 2010 had always contained a warning. After the burial, I went back to the courtyard where the tree had stood. The spot was now a rectangle of fresh soil, and the remaining plants looked suddenly ordinary. I realized the tree had grown lush not because nature wanted to taunt me, but because nature does what it always does. It uses what is available. That thought was grimly comforting. If the world can turn death into growth without sentiment, then I can turn grief into vigilance without apology. I left a single daisy at the edge of the yard and walked away, refusing to let that place remain the center of my map. I asked the archive office for old maps, and found the 2010 zoning plan that showed an irrigation trench running behind my grandmother's yard. It explained why the soil stayed soft even in dry months, and it explained why the tree there grew fast and bright. I requested the old utility records and discovered a brief service interruption logged on the morning after Mai vanished. The kind of mundane detail that would never matter to someone who had not learned to treat mundane as a hiding place. When you cannot find witnesses, you interrogate systems, power grids, supply deliveries, payroll logs, radio schedules. Systems do not love you, but they also do not pity you, and that makes them reliable. At Blue Gate Solvents, a retired guard recognized my father's name and gave me a look that held 20 years of quiet judgments. He remembered Hai as punctual and polite, and always carrying his own drink. That last phrase sounded harmless until I wrote it down and saw it next to the cup in my hypnosis memory. The guard could not testify to crimes, but he could testify to habits, and habits build a scaffold for truth. I thanked him and walked out past warning signs about solvents and respirators, thinking about how easily danger becomes ordinary when you see it every day. I interviewed my father's former co-worker, a man who had been demoted for reporting safety violations. He said management taught them 2 lessons. Keep your head down and keep your paperwork clean. When I asked about missing chemicals, he snorted and said, the only missing the company cared about was missing production targets. He described how small amounts could be carried out in lunchboxes, hidden under rice and fried fish, because inspectors were too bored to search meals. Hearing that, I felt my childhood lunch tins turn from innocent objects into accomplices, and I hated how quickly objects can change meaning. The devout neighbor who had once provided my grandmother an alibi finally spoke after I showed her the excavation photographs. She cried without sound, the way people cry when they are ashamed of their own devotion. She admitted that on the afternoon of 12 July, 2010, my grandmother had slipped away from the prayer gathering for a short time, claiming she needed sugar. The neighbor had covered for her because covering felt like kindness, and kindness is easy to weaponize in the hands of someone without conscience. She said she thought she was protecting an old woman from gossip, not protecting murder from consequence. My mother tried a different tactic in interrogation. She acted like a wounded martyr, listing every sacrifice she claimed she had made for her daughters. I let her speak until she ran out of applause that did not exist. Then I asked her to explain why she kept the old kitchen cup in a storage box labeled Memories, and why her fingerprints were the freshest on it despite her claim she never went near my childhood things. Her eyes flicked to the one-way mirror, searching for an audience. When she found none, her shoulders sank as if she had been holding up a lie by sheer posture. After my brother confronted me at the cafe, I sent him a letter instead of another call. I wrote that I did not want revenge. I wanted a clean narrative, because a clean narrative is the only ground a person can stand on without sinking. I wrote that he could be angry at me and still accept reality, the way a person can hate the rain and still admit the sky is wet. I wrote that our sister had not existed to purchase his future, and that if he ever had children, he should teach them that love is not earned by being useful. He never replied, but later he began attending the court sessions quietly, sitting in the back, which was a kind of answer. On one patrol shift, weeks after the burial, we responded to a call about a child locked out on a balcony. The child was safe, only frightened, but the scene shook me in a way my colleagues did not understand. I watched the mother apologize and promise to change, and I wondered how many promises evaporate the moment a door closes. When we returned the child to the apartment, I knelt to the child's height and told him that adults are supposed to protect, and if they fail, it is not the child's fault. The sentence tasted unfamiliar in my mouth, because no one had ever said it to me when I needed it most. In my own case, I learned that evidence is not only physical, it is also behavioral. My parents' rage toward me after Mai vanished had never been proportionate to a mistake. It had been the rage of people whose plan misfired and who needed someone to carry the cost. I had spent years believing I deserved that rage, and the belief had kept me obedient. Seeing the pattern now did not erase the pain, but it loosened its grip. I began to understand that guilt can be installed like software, and that uninstalling it requires patience and repetition. The hypnotherapist warned me that recovered memory can feel like a second trauma, because your body relives what your mind avoided. She taught me simple grounding. Name 5 objects. Feel the chair under your thighs. Inhale slowly. Exhale slower. I followed her instructions after the session, and still found myself shaking in the hallway. Captain Min Kwang walked beside me without speaking, the way good mentors do when advice would be a distraction. Later, he said he had seen many violent crimes, but the ones that haunted him were the ones where the victim had to be brave in secret. A child should not have to be strategic, he said, and the sentence stayed with me. I returned once to the night market on the old road and bought 2 tea eggs out of habit. I ate one and held the other in my palm until it cooled. The blind vendor asked whether the case was finished, and I told him the law had spoken, but my heart would need longer. He nodded as if he understood time better than sighted people do. Before I left, he asked me to tell my sister that someone had finally listened. I almost laughed at the impossibility of the request, then realized he was offering me a ritual, a way to pass a message into the only place messages can go now: memory. I thanked him and walked home under neon, carrying a quiet weight that was not entirely mine. To verify the radio chime, I visited the community station that used to broadcast time signals to factory workers. The receptionist led me into a back room filled with spools and dusty speakers. A volunteer showed me a ledger where they wrote down daily maintenance, including a note on 12 July 2010 that the noon chime ran exactly on schedule despite a power fluctuation elsewhere. It was not dramatic proof, but it pinned the blind vendor's memory to a real clock. In investigations, pinning is what keeps a story from drifting into myth. I rewatched the footage from the Seaside Park case, the one that had triggered my supervisor's warning about survival odds. The father in that case had looked relieved, and later we found messages on his phone searching for institutions that would take a child with disabilities. I used the case in court to explain motive. Not every parent who loses a child is innocent, and not every tear is grief. I hated making that argument, because it felt like poisoning the idea of family, but my own family had already done that long before I wore a uniform. When my grandmother tried to bargain with Faith, the prosecutor asked her a simple question. If repentance is real, why did it take handcuffs to bring her to confession? She answered with scripture, and the courtroom did not laugh, because laughter would have been too gentle. I watched her lips move and remembered how she once told me my mother's silence was punishment from heaven. In that moment, I understood that some people use religion the way others use money, as a shield against consequences. Shields fail when the law insists on looking past them. The toxicology expert testified that the chemical my father stole would cause collapse within a range, not a single predictable minute. He explained that panic, heat, and an asthma attack could accelerate the outcome. I sat in the gallery listening to the science and realized how easy it is to hide behind probability. My parents had lived in a world of maybe, probably, and no one will know. My sister had lived in a world of immediate decisions.